Good morning everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is a canning video that's been requested. So in my most recent What We Eat in a Week meals, I did a meat pie using some beef that I had canned. So I purposely filmed canning the beef and stuff as well so that I could put it together a little bit better for anyone who wanted to see it after seeing the pie, if that makes sense. So I did film the process of canning the beef as well as the process of actually making the pie from scratch. So I thought I would do that up today. Now, the beef that I used was a chuck steak, a whole chuck, sorry, not a chuck steak, a whole chuck that I managed to get cheap just before Christmas, and had been vacuum sealed in the fridge, other than we'd used some for Birria, which was brilliant, but a fair bit of meat used, so we're trying to, diversify the use of the beef because beef is fairly expensive. So we canned some up for the shelf so that we could use it over a longer period of time as well. So I'll take you along and show you how I did it. Alright, so you want to start with clean jars. They do not have to be sterilised or anything though, because they are going to be canned. So they just need to be washed out and clean, warm soapy water, and cleaned, ready to go, like you would any jar for anything. I cut what was left of the whole chuck into chunks. You want to cut it into decent sized chunks because you don't want it to shred into tiny pieces in the jars, but you also want them small enough that you can sort of pack them in the jar. So you want to get as much meat into each jar as possible. There will be shrinkage as you do it. So you want to fill the jars with these chunks, and you want to push them all down so that they go into all the gaps, because they will shrink when you process them. And it's fine, except that you're using more jars for less meat if you don't jam it in there. So I like to get it jammed in really nice and tight so that you don't have that wastage of space in those jars and that sort of thing. So you want to fill them up with chunks, sort of push all the chunks into any sort of air pockets and push it down nice and firmly, and you want to fill it all the way up to the neck of the jar. Any of the really large chunks of fat that were there, I fed to the dogs. You do want some fat in your jars, because if there's that's where a lot of the flavour is in meat, especially in beef. So if you've got no fat in with the beef when it's being processed, then you're going to lose some flavour. So you still want some good marbling and some good streaking and things like that, but there were some really big chunks of fat that was on sort of the out edges of the beef, and I didn't want to put that in there either, so I decided to just give that to the dogs. Now, I dry can my beef, so I'm not adding any liquid at all to these jars. You can add liquid though. You can add stock, you can add water, you can add bouillon powder, you could add some salt, anything like that, however you want to do it. I like to dry can my meat. I do this with chicken and pork as well, and it produces its own juices, and then I can use it however I want afterwards. You're basically just pressure cooking meat in a jar. So if it's just a beef on its own, it's just shredded beef when it comes out. And that's the way I like to do it, because I like to be able to use it for a myriad of different things. I don't like to have to use the jar based on the ingredients in it. I want to be able to use the jar just as beef. So I just do them dry canned with the beef. So once the jars are full, you need to clean your rims with vinegar. So I use white vinegar. You want a cloth that preferably doesn't leave behind too many fibres, and you want to clean the rims with white vinegar. Make sure they're nice and clean, there's no bits of meat on it, no bits of grease and things like that. I'm using Fowler's jars today. Fowler's jars have a rubber ring that goes around the outside edge, so you want to make sure you clean that outside edge where that rubber ring is going and place the rubber ring on. Some people do put the rubber rings on before they fill the jars. I personally just put them on afterwards. I like to run the vinegar around the ring after the ring's on the jar, because I've been handling the ring, so there's potential grease from my hands on the ring, so I feel more comfortable running vinegar over that again, just in case. We also live off-grid in basically a desert and have an outdoor kitchen, so can't be too careful. With the lids, I like to wash them in warm soapy water first. They are stainless steel reusable lids that I'm using on these jars, so the rubber is the single-use item in this particular style of jar. So I wash the lids in warm soapy water. These are number 31 jars and the lids are size 4. I like to wipe the lids out with vinegar as well. Again, I've just washed them, but if I've handled them, if they've got dust, things like that, I just prefer to wipe them out with vinegar just before I place them on top. So I wipe them out, place them on top of the jars, and keep on going through the jars as I do that. The Fowler's jars have clips that hold the lids onto the rubber while they're processing, similar to the rings on a ball mason jar. It's the clips that are holding the lid in contact with the rubber to create the seal. Fowler's Ricola recommends a single clip on all their jars. All my jars and clips and everything are secondhand. Some of them are a little odd sizes because there's slightly different sizes for glass lids, as well as there's 4 1/4 inch as well as 4-inch clips, and none of mine can you see titles on because they're all in bad condition because I don't keep them exceptionally clean because nothing stays clean here. So I personally use 2. The clips potentially are a little stretched, which means if you use a single one, you've got the potential for the lids to lift in that, but Fowler's does not recommend using 2 clips. So I personally choose to use 2 clips, especially when pressure canning, but Fowler's recommendation is only to use a single one. Now, your jars are cold because you just packed cold meat into cold jars, so you need to start off with a cold canner as well. So you have to remember that if you're putting hot product into your jars, then you need to start with a warm canner. If you've got cold product, you need to start with a cold canner. You want the water in the canner to be the same temperature as the jars that you're placing in it. So I'm using my Presto canner here, and I have put it on the stove. It's got the rack in the bottom so that the jars are not in direct contact with the bottom of the canner, and you need to put a minimum of about 3 quarts of water into the canner, and that will give you approximately the right amount of water to give you the length of time that you need for processing. You don't want to go over sort of halfway up your jars. So because it's pressure canning, you don't want the jars covered in water, and you only want around about half the height of the jars of water in the bottom of your canner, which on average ends up being around about 3 quarts of water. Once your jars are in there, you put your lid on and you turn the burner on. So what you're waiting for next is for your vent to start venting steam. So you want the vent on the top of the lid to get to a steady stream of steam. I have tried to show it here, but it's not the easiest thing to show on camera. But you want it to vent that steady stream of steam for 10 minutes so that the entire canner is pressurized. So if your elevation is between 0 and 2,000 feet, you need to pressure can at 11 pounds of pressure. Above 2,000, it's 12. 2,000 to 4,000, I think it's 12 pounds. So you need to check your elevation for your area. You can use the pressure gauge on the pressure canner and sit it at 11 pounds, or you can choose to use your weight. So I can't use a 10-pound weight because it will keep the pressure at 10 pounds or under. You want your weight to jiggle. So you're going to turn it on. Once you've had that steady stream, you put your weight on it and then you leave it. As it comes up to pressure, your weight is going to start to jiggle. You want your weight to jiggle at a slow-ish sort of a pace. Just sort of, mine's probably going a little too fast here because it's hard to control on my burner. But you want it to jiggle at a fairly slow pace, which means that it's hitting 15 pounds of pressure or just slightly higher, which is why it's jiggling. It's letting off a little tiny bit of pressure every time it jiggles in that way, and that allows for it to maintain that 15 pounds of pressure. So once your weight is jiggling, that's when you start your timer for your processing time. Now the 31s are around about a litre, very similar to a quart size jar, so they get processed for a quart time. So quart timing for a meat product is 90 minutes of processing time. It's 75 minutes for a pint size. Or once your weight is jiggling at a nice pace, you start your timer for 90 minutes. Once the 90 minutes is up, you turn your burner off and leave it alone. So you need to let it drop pressure naturally down to nil. All you do is you watch your pressure gauge if you've got one, or if you don't have a pressure gauge, there is a little, I didn't film it, I didn't think about it, there is a little valve that when the pressure canner is under pressure, it pops up, and once the pressure has released from the canner, it will drop back into the lid. So once that's dropped back down, it shows that there is no longer the canner is no longer under pressure, and you can take the lid off. So then you take the lid off and let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes just to even out a little bit more before you go fiddling with anything. After that, you can remove your jars to a board. I have stainless steel benches, so I'm not going to put them directly on a stainless steel bench. That would be silly. So I have wooden cutting boards and put it on wooden cutting boards. You can use tea towels or those mats that, those soft mats that you use for drying stuff on and that sort of thing. Or if you've got a wooden bench, I'm sure it's fine on a wooden bench as well, though you might not want to risk damaging the bench either. Wooden cutting boards is what I find the best for that. And then you need to, once they're out, they'll continue to bubble, so you can see that it's still bubbling. If a jar isn't bubbling, it's a good sign that it potentially didn't seal. So if you've got a jar, if you pull them out and you've got one jar that isn't bubbling, leave it alone. But when you're checking seals, it's more than likely that that jar will not have sealed correctly, because there's no pressure in the jar causing the bubbling, which means that there is a leak somewhere, whether the lid hasn't sat properly or the ring isn't sitting properly or whatever else. So you need to leave the jars for about 24 hours. So you don't touch them for 24 hours so that they can cool down on their own, create any extra sealing that they need to create, and then you check the seals after that. So the next day you can remove your clips, or if you're in ball mason jars, you remove your rings, and you check if they've sealed. I always just pick them up by the lid, give them a little bit of a jiggle as I pick them up with the lid, and if the lid stays on and it's concave, then it's sealed. You need to wipe your jars down before you put them on your shelf, because if there's any sort of residue on them, that will attract mold and bugs and things like that. So it's not going to affect the inside of the jars, because it can't travel to inside the jar because the jar's sealed. But you can end up with mold on the outside of the jars, or you can end up with bugs that get stuck on it and things like that. It's much nicer to clean the jars before you put them away in the pantry. It's a good habit to get into. So one of the things that I do with this beef is the pies, which is why I'm doing the video in this sort of an order too. So I wanted to show you how we make our pies from this beef. This beef is good for a lot of things. It's stews, fillings, anything. It's shredded beef. You could use it however you wanted. But one of the things that we do enjoy is pies. So the first thing I did was I made up some pie crust, and I used my standard pie crust. I do 400 grams of plain flour, 60 grams of olive oil, 60 grams of lard, and 110 grams of ice water with a pinch of salt. And I bring it all together in my Thermomix. You could use a food presser, you could use a pastry, the pastry knives. You could do it by hand, however you want. I use my Thermomix because I have it, may as well. Once it's into the little balls, you pull it on, pour it out onto your dough mat or whatever you use, and bring it all together into one sort of cohesive disc. You don't want to work it too hard, but you want it all stuck together so that they're in sort of disc shapes. My lard was liquid when I did this, which is probably why my dough is a little bit crumbly. I probably should have refrigerated the lard before doing it, but I didn't, so that's how it is. Split it into two, because that dough batch gives you a top and a bottom, or two bottoms, and you can use puff pastry as a top, however you want. And stick it in the fridge until you're ready to use it. So for the inside of the pie, you can go as simple or as complicated as you want. It's a pie. You can do whatever you want. You can add veggies into your pie or not add veggies into your pie. You could cheese, you could bacon, pepper, however you want. We just went really, really simple this day. And so I used really tasty but really bad for me gravy powder and made up a batch of gravy in the Thermomix, and I just did it there so that I didn't have to worry about whisking it while I was doing other things. And then I rolled the pastry out. Now, I have been meaning to buy myself some cast iron pie dishes. I haven't got that yet, so I'm using this. It's a lidded container, so it's not really a pie dish, but it's an enameled cast iron deep dish thing that works okay for a pie, but it's a very deep pie, so it takes a fair bit of filling. So I lined that with the pastry. For that, obviously, because it's such a deep dish too, the pastry is going to be sort of in the pie dish rather than on the outside edges, which is fine. And then I poured the beef into the gravy. I really probably should have thickened the gravy up a bit more, but I was just, as I said, we were going really, really simple tonight. So I just poured it into the gravy and mixed it through. And then I used a slotted spoon to put that beef into the pie dish, so that I was getting some, like, the meat was coated in the gravy, but I wasn't getting an excessive amount of liquids, because then you're going to have pie that sort of goes everywhere. So I used the slotted spoon to get all the beef out and put a little bit of extra gravy over the top of it. rolled out the pastry top and then pinched it all together. So as I said, because it was such a deep dish, I put the pastry on the inside of the dish and pinched the edges over the top rather than doing it over the edge of the dish, which is probably a good thing anyway, because this pie was going to be pretty sloppy because I didn't thicken that gravy up very well, so it means that it's not going to go everywhere. It's going to stay in the dish, which is a good thing. Now you have to remember that everything in this pie is already cooked. All you're doing is heating it through and cooking the pastry, so it's really going to vary. Cooking time, 25-30 minutes on 200-ish maybe is what I probably did. Again, cooking in a barbecue, it's a little bit variable, but everything's cooked, so all you need to do is cook that pastry and warm everything through. Once again, cutting a really hot pie without allowing it time to set up, because that's the way we roll. So the pie was falling apart as I was cutting it, which is very, very normal when you're cutting something hot and you haven't let it sit for, half an hour to sort of firm up and thicken up a bit. But we served it with mashed potato, steamed veg, and then I'd thickened up the leftover gravy that was there with all the juices from the beef in it as well. I'd thickened that up a little bit more and we poured it over the top. So this used 2 jars of beef, which is quite a large amount of beef. You can add so many things to that beef to make the pie filling that would stretch that out. As I said, I was doing simple and I didn't. I didn't want to add veggies to the pie because I was serving it with veggies, though I could have added all those veggies to the pie and made 2 pies, and then we could have just had more pie, but then you're eating more pastry unnecessarily. So it's all a bit of a toss-up as to how you want to do it. For 8 of us, that one pie dish was just a single piece of pie per person with mash, veg, gravy. And it was plenty as that, but there was no leftover pie or anything like that, and it was a significant amount of beef used. But as I said, you can do whatever you want. Like steak and cheese is really nice, but no one can have cheese. I'm not real sure what else I'd put in it if I wasn't putting veggies in it. Like, adding chunks of carrot and potato and stuff would be really nice. It'd be a beef and vegetable pie, but then serving it with vegetables as well, I suppose you're just eating more vegetables. Don't know. I have to have a think, because using 2 jars per pie is a fair amount of beef. So by trying to extend that beef a little bit more. So if you make beef pies, like steak pies like that, let me know what else you put in them. To try to use less meat but still have enough of the flavour, and then what you serve it with, because that's where I was a little torn. Like if I add potatoes and veg into the pie and then serve it with potatoes and veg, it seemed a little, but then again, it's just more veggies, isn't it? So, seems silly to have worried about it, doesn't it? Anyway, that was the canned beef and how we made the pies from it. As I make other meals out of those jars, I will make sure to film them as well and show you too. We do this method for pork, chicken and beef, dry canned, all of it, and we use it in heaps of ways. Chicken done like this is amazing. You've just got cans of shredded chicken, so jars of shredded chicken. So you just open a jar, and we tend to just put it in a cast iron fry pan just to warm it through, and we'll eat that as a chicken, like mixed with mayo on sandwiches, or mixed through like if I've got a stir fry and I've got no meat in the fridge, a jar of chicken can be mixed through a stir fry, or any sort of a pasta or anything like that as well. And it's probably less chicken than we would eat in a meal normally by doing it in a jar, because you only want to open one jar, and they're smallish jars. So I don't know how that works out. I've never really checked. But yeah, dry canning the chicken, the pork, and the beef works really well for us, and we like to use it in a whole lot of ways. So it's definitely something I would suggest doing. A lot of people hesitate to can meats. I really recommend giving it a go. When you open the jar, it does have a little bit of a smell. That smell is reminiscent of dog food, because dog food is canned meat. So it makes sense that that's the kind of smell it would have. But once you get past that smell, no different than opening, like, when you open fresh chicken that's been gas sealed or whatever, and you get that whiff and you go, oh my god, is that okay? It's a little bit the same with the jars of meat. They have that slightly unpleasant odor when you open them, but they taste great, perfectly fine. So if you can get through trying it that first time, I think you'll find that it's not really that much of an issue. So thank you very much for watching the channel again, and I will see you again on the next video. Thanks, guys.